Introducing Bushy Martin, the founder of Know How Property, author of award-winning books, The Freedom Formula and Get Invested, and regular commentator of property and finance on all good news channels. Now, with over 20 years of active investor experience, Bushy has helped 1,700 plus buyers secure over $600 million in property and is recognized as a top 10 property specialist and Mentor of the Year finalist. Bushy is a veteran of this space and a mountain of knowledge. I wanted to get Bushy on the show because we talk a lot about different markets. We talk about property management. We talk to real estate agents. Now, at his core, Bushy is a finance expert. And, we were just having a chat before we got on the show. And I said, mate, we have to stop because you're saying so many good things. I want our viewers and listeners to hear it. Bushy, welcome to the channel. Welcome to the show.
Awesome, Dom. Been really looking forward to catching up, mate. I really enjoyed our conversation recently on the Get Invested podcast as part of a Property Hub network that I'm a part of. And I love your enthusiasm, your passion, and what you're doing to assist investors at all levels around the place, Dom. So love talking all things property with people who have that same amount of energy and commitment to helping others to do the right thing.
Thanks, mate. And, likewise, you've got a lot of really good work happening behind the scenes. And one thing that I really appreciate is your commitment to the finance piece, because as we just discussed, a lot of property investors get hell bent on the property, but the piece of real estate only works as good as the finance piece. And it sounds crazy because you think, well, a good piece of real estate is a good piece of real estate. But if the funding isn't done correctly, that can undo that piece of real estate and your whole portfolio. And I used to be a financial planner back in the day. And one of the pieces of advice that I got from my mentor was, don't fuck with your client's cash flow. And, it's so true. What the problems that you see with people is their cash flow not being quite right. And if you can't hold on to the investment, if it's not structured right, it's drama. So, would you like to elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, some great points you've made there straight up, Dom. As I was saying in the green room, I learned very early in my own investment journey that property is a game of finance. And unfortunately, a lot of investors focus purely on the property. That's the first thing they do. They start scrolling through realestate.com and domain and getting excited about the color of the kitchen and the bathrooms. But in my own experience, property is actually the last thing you consider. You've got to get all the other ducks in a row. And a very important part of that is the finance piece, the way you structure the finance, the capacity that you can achieve with finance. Just as an example, Dom, there's about 40 odd lenders that you can tap into in the residential space here in Australia. There's about 2,000 different loan solutions. And across those, there's over a 55% variation on how much you can borrow. Now, I've often said that most people, when they think about finance, they think about one thing, and that's interest rate. Well, interest rate is just the tip of the iceberg, because the most limited resource that any property investor has, whether you're an investor or a homeowner, actually, is your capacity. And we've seen over the last 12 months in particular where capacities are really under threat, because a lot of people don't know that for every 1% rise in the interest rates, your borrowing capacity drops by about 100 grand on the average loan. So that means that we've seen in excess of $400,000 shaved off people's capacity in the last 12 months. So you really need to get clever about how you structure it, what you're buying the property in terms of the entity, because that also affects the financing component of the situation. And then make sure that you're tapping into a lender who has policies that are going to allow you to maximize that capacity way beyond the other. Because a 55% variation is the difference between buying a $500,000 property and a $750,000 to $800,000 property. And if they both grow at the same rate over time, you're going to end up with a much more significant nest egg at the end of the journey. So finance is key. And the other thing that need to reinforce from the great comment that you made around the cash flow affordability. I don't see many investors looking hard at that affordability piece. They look at purchase price. Yet, can I afford to spend the money on the property? That's about as far as they go. One thing that we do for ourselves and for the investors we help is to use some very sophisticated software to look at every cost in both buying and then holding a property, to break it down to how much per week in year 1, 3, 5, 10, 15 and beyond is this property actually going to cost you or put in your pocket, depending on how you've structured it, so that you can actually last the distance and then reap the rewards at the end. Because as you would know, Dom, over 54% of first-time investors sell the property within the first 5 years. And I've seen firsthand that most of them, because they're not paying attention to the finance and they're not paying attention to the cash flow, they suddenly find that they've structured it wrong. They've bought the wrong property in the wrong location with the wrong yields, with the wrong finance, and all of a sudden it's burning a massive hole in their pocket. They throw their hands up in the air, sell the property, walk away from a sensational wealth creation vehicle, and never actually achieve the results that they got into it in the first place.
I've seen this on a number of different occasions, and it's quite sad. It's really sad talking to a young mother with a child. There's dad's off work and doing what he can. They bought a house, an apartment, whatever it is. They've put all their money into it, but they didn't account for X, Y, and Z. And then they're faced with a circumstance where they have to sell the property, and selling it, they may not make their money back. They're going backwards. And then they're looking at, well, I have to go on rent. And then the rent is, not much of it's not saving them much money anyways. So they're in a net negative position in so many fronts. And it's sad because they've lost their original deposit. And now they're looking at, well, I can't go back into the market for 5, 10 years or whatever it is. It's an uphill battle. That's why that first property is so important. Whether it is your own home, your own investment, I'm not going to judge you. I can't shoot at anyone else because I've just recently bought my own home, and it's a different type of investment, if you will, depending if you treat it that way. But Bushy, looking at the current circumstance, I want to just get a sense of how you're seeing the market and what all these interest rate rises have meant for you, and how you're approaching this current market with your clients.
Yeah, it's a great question, Dom. And it's fair to say I absolutely love times like this when there's lots of media-generated uncertainty. I've always been a contrarian in the way I approach it. And, we've all heard the Warren Buffett term, be greedy when people are fearful and fearful when people are greedy. Well, there's a lot of fear floating through the sentiment at the moment. And if we sort of look at the key drivers of any investment, actually, whether it's property or anything else, it's always supply, demand, and increasingly it's the sentiment value, because we've all got iPhones and we're getting channeled with fear-driven hysteria every second of the day. And we need to look at things in terms of the macro, the micro, down to the micro level. So we need to sort of adjust those lens. And I'm a big fan of John Lindemann, the very highly credentialed property analyst. And the lens that I like to look at property markets and property opportunities is through what he calls the 3 Ps, and then applying my own 3 Is of growth to that. So the 3 Ps are people, purchasing power, and property. And if we break those down, people is really about population. It's about where are people moving to into an area, and is that having an impact on demand? Purchasing power, which comes back to the finance piece that we've already spoken about, is about capacity and affordability. And then the 3rd P is properties. Are there enough properties available to suit the demand in a certain location? Now, we then overlay that with what I call the 3 Is of growth. So if you're in the growth phase of your investment journey, where you're accumulating and looking to build your nest egg to the level it needs to then be rationalized to give you the cash flow, then there are 3 key drivers that are more important than ever now, given the massive uplift in property values that happened post-COVID. And those 3 Is are new infrastructure, new industry, and strong and growing incomes. So if we apply those to what's happening in the market now, then from the supply side, We're seeing extremely tight rental vacancies pretty much across the board, and we're seeing rents rising accordingly. There's very limited stock for sale. If you look in most areas of the country at the moment, we're about 40% down on what the long-term average of properties for sale is. And we've got a very troubled construction sector. So less properties being built and less properties likely to be built in the foreseeable future. Now, depending on who you listen to and where you get your information, we're somewhere between 150 and 300 odd thousand properties short of what we need to be supplying the demand right now. Now, if you flip the table and you look at the demand side, where we're looking at buying capacity and property purchase challenges that are coming out of that due to these finance restrictions. And, we've seen a 30 to 35% reduction in buying capacity over the last 12 months. But on the flip side of that, we're seeing massive population growth. So 400 odd thousand last year, 400 odd thousand this year. It drops down to 300,000 and then 250,000 years beyond that. Well, that's producing very strong rental yields, which means that that's improving the cash flow affordability. So if we bring that all together, what that's telling us is that we need to be looking for areas and buyers where people are moving, where they've got good purchasing power and there's limited supply. Now, if you bring those three together in terms of the opportunity that's flowing out of that, I think the sleeper that a lot of people are not getting their heads around at the moment are cashed up boomers downsizing to coastal regional hubs that are close to the cities. From the cash flow perspective, so that's the growth opportunities that I think we're seeing. From the cash flow perspective, though, Dom, it's because we're getting such an influx of skilled migrants, and most of them tend to initially rent for a couple of years, and they tend to land in the major cities. Then from cash flow opportunities, it's apartments in cities where skilled migrants are needing to rent. And that's Melbourne and Brisbane in particular, and to a lesser degree, Sydney. So that's what the market's telling us, and that's where we're focusing our attention at the moment.
Really, really good insights there. There's so much to pick apart because I have the same philosophy. I call it pies, population investments and, economic development and supply. Yep. But what you're talking about there is a few key factors that are vitally important, and you're following the flow of people and monitoring the incoming supply. That's the fundamentals that moves it all.
Yeah.
And you've pinpointed two specific opportunities, which again, I agree with. We're looking at the largest intergenerational wealth transfer ever. We've got boomers that are coming out of large homes, they're selling them, and they've got huge amounts of cash that they're now downsizing into different styles of property. But then also some of them are literally passing the money on to the next generation. And it's interesting to follow that flow of money to say, well, where are they going to go? What type of property are they after? I've spoken about this on other podcasts. Yeah. And then also following the flow of migrants into the country. It's not a surprise. Australia's gone through many waves of migrants, and we stick together. You like to stick around with like-minded people. There was the Italians, the Greeks, the Chinese, there's there's a lot of Poms, there's Indians. It's happening in waves, and it makes sense to stay around your community groups. People come into areas where they want to, where they can earn a good income. We rent for a while. I think it's about 15% of new inbound migrants actually purchase, which is surprising.
Yeah.
And then they go and buy something when they can afford it. But if I'm going to pinpoint you a little bit more, you said the opportunities are for coastal towns just outside of city centres, and then also looking at Melbourne, Brisbane, inner city. What locations do you like?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I've got to, I guess, state my thoughts around forecasts, Dom.
Yeah.
Because, again, I'm a big fan of the world's greatest living investor, Warren Buffett. And he's said for years that forecasts are there to try and make fortune tellers look good. And I reckon he's right, because the accuracy and the reliability of forecasts is pretty average, because, as you know, property conditions have more combinations than a Rubik's Cube, which is about 48 quadrillion, I think, in the context of it. But if we look at those major drivers that you and I have just spoken about, and again, I tend to rely on proven analysts who are supporting their information with hard data. And the best one that I've found, in addition to all the normal exercises, is John Lindeman. His team, Property Power and Partners, they've actually got a 90% success rate in their predictions over the last 12 years since he's been doing this work. So if we break it down, I'll give you some of the areas regionally, because that's easy to locate. And again, we're talking about the cashed up boomer downsizers that are moving to regional coastal lifestyle and recreation hubs. So in the Queensland vicinity, the areas that are going to continue to do really well because of that demand are the areas like Hervey Bay, Sunshine Coast, and the Gold Coast. In northern New South Wales is also going to benefit from that. The southern coastal cities as well in New South Wales. In Victoria, it's East Gippsland, where there's a great opportunity for price uplift. And in South Australia, which has sort of been the silent performer over the last 12 months, there's three great peninsulas in South Australia that are going to benefit from the cashed up boomers, and that's the Fleurieu in particular, with the wine region, and the York and Eyre Peninsula as well, because they're coming off very affordable, low cost bases. They're only about an hour from the city. So they're all going to benefit significantly from that. And the other thing that's worth mentioning in those sorts of destinations that I'm talking about is that they're also very popular holiday and tourist destinations. So they actually offer high cash flow from short-term rental opportunities at the same time. So, as you know, well and truly, Dom, about 70% of property purchases are owner-occupiers. And the real benefit of being an investor, being in the 30%, is all we need to do is slipstream on the emotion of those investors who are buying with their hearts, not their heads, and locate those properties alongside what they're doing, and we can do very well. And the real opportunity, because we're seeing such big constraints around the financing piece at the moment, we're seeing a lot of investors who are just coming back to and say, we want to buy another property, and you run the numbers for them. So I'm sorry, the interest rate rises have knocked you out. What's good about boomers is they're cashed up. They're not borrowing money at all. They're actually downsizing and using cash to secure properties. So there's no limitations on them. And that's where we want to be slipstreaming in behind in terms of securing properties and locations that are going to enjoy the rise as a consequence of that.
Great strategy. Really like it. Which leads me on to my next question. I was going to ask you about what do you think about 2024, but it's kind of irrelevant, really. And I think a more interesting question for me.
I'll tell you what I think about 2024 very, very briefly.
Okay, yeah, go for it.
And again, I've been talking to John Lindeman personally a fair bit in recent times. If we look back through history, since 1901, there's only been 5 times where property prices have actually boomed. And when we mean boom, that's growth of at least 15% growth in a year. We had one just recently post-pandemic. And each time that this has occurred, there's been massive increases in population, which is accompanied by a real shortage of properties. Now, that's exactly where we're at right now. So there's a wave of new immigrants coming in. It's an absolute flood coming in. So here's a bit of a prediction, and again, this is crystal balling, so a lot of dynamics come to it. But I think by the middle of next year, those locations that we've been talking about are going to be in the height of the next boom.
It's a good prediction, and I actually agree with you. I agree with you because it's just simple supply and demand dynamics, and I'm on social media everywhere, and there's a lot of armchair experts that will expound about, interest rates going up mean property prices can't go any further, recession's coming, blah, blah, blah. But in a way, it's kind of irrelevant because we're not talking about a pure investment. It's a home.
Yep.
People need to live somewhere. They need a house. And at a point, even if prices increase to a point, what happens is there's urban sprawl. It'll reach a price cap for a location, and then people will move out. And there's only so much you can say on social media, and it's a long form that really elaborates on that explanation. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing price growth in inner city locations spiking 10, 15, 20, 30%. And then that keeps on sprawling outward.
Yeah.
And again, what we're seeing is price growth in real estate in key markets that are what we would call blue chip. And blue chip is sort of defined by low levels of sales in that market, people that have a high level of ownership, there's not a lot of debt. So the area that I just recently purchased in, I think it's like 40% of the people that own property there have zero debt. And then the rest is, some of them have mortgages, and then there's a small rental market. So it's a very tightly held suburb. There's not a lot of sales. I think it's like 100, 150 a year.
Yeah.
They're blue chip locations,
Perfect. And you're reading that spot on, Dom, because in times when it's difficult to get our hands on money, invest in areas where people are buying that don't have to borrow money at all. And that's scarcely held suburbs like you've just described. And given that people aren't really getting their head around the massive number of cashed up boomers that are flowing through, the next 10 years is going to be dominated in property by the movement of the boomers. There's no question about it. And there's about a third of our population that are 55 years and older, Dom. So, and most of them that are going to drive what we're talking about are in very good financial positions. So that's the good oil on where to focus your energy, I think.
That's a good shout out. So what's your investment philosophy when it comes to real estate? Everyone has I don't want to ask you what the best way is, but what's your philosophy when it comes to real estate investing?
Yeah, let me walk you through this, because there's a little bit to this, Dom. I guess the first thing I'd say is I have always started with the end in mind. I used to be an architect, so I was always visualizing exactly how something was going to be and then working out how to get there. And I call it living by design now. That's the philosophy that we adopt. It's what I've documented in my book, The Freedom Formula. Because for me, it's actually all about time. It's not about money. It's about time to do the things that are important to me. So the first thing that I take into account with that is that whatever I'm investing in, I don't create a second job when I'm doing it, because I actually want to get my time back the other way. And I also adopt what I call a wealth by stealth approach. So that's about being borderless, and it's about being long-term. And if I was to sum up the philosophy in a nutshell, it's using as little of my own money to secure as big an asset value as possible, as quickly as possible, and make it as affordable as possible, and then use time, the tenant, and the tax office together with capital growth to do all the lifting work. Now, if I was to summarize that all, I would say I'm what I call a passive-aggressive investor. It's about becoming aggressive about creating passive residual income. And everything we've invested in for a long time now, Dom, has been built around three key criteria. And whether that's property, shares, our businesses, it must create residual income, it must grow in value, and it must be saleable. Now, the other thing that I want to mention around the strategy piece for us, and this is quite different to what a lot of investors I see, is we take what I call a top-down scarcity approach. So we determine if we're in the growth phase. So when we started our journey, it was all about growth. And then as we projected our nest egg was going to reach the level it needed to be to create the income, we then converted to cash flow. So I talk about the capital growth to cash flow curve. But during the accumulation stage, which where most Australian investors are in the property sphere, it's about determining what your achievable and affordable spend is. So do the numbers on the affordability piece. And then if you're in the growth phase, buy real houses for real people in tightly held suburbs, just like you've just done yourself, whether you're buying a home or an investment property. And then look at the 15,000 suburbs and nearly 11 million property locations and or build them across the country to satisfy that, rather than chase hotspots. Because there's a lot of hotspotters out there that will just hear about a location, buy whatever they can afford. And if they can only buy a unit, that's what they buy. What they don't realise is that a unit's not going to enjoy anywhere near the growth that a real home, a 3 or 4 bedroom home on a block of dirt is going to achieve. And they don't end up achieving their goals. So if we would break that down, if it's top down, start with the end in mind, work out how you want to live, what sort of nest egg you need, because that will dictate the strategy. If you're in growth, it's 3 or 4 bedroom homes in tightly held areas, and apply those 3 I's of infrastructure, income, and industry to it. If it's cash flow, and you're rationalising into that tax-effective cash flow, it's more into higher yielding opportunities like units, apartments, and commercial property. So, and the other thing I need to mention here, which is going probably a bit different from a lot of investors, I'm a big fan of new build properties. And I'm not talking about new build properties in greenfield areas where there's unlimited acres of land to be developed. I'm talking about building good quality homes in tightly held areas that have all of those 3 I's attached to it, because there's some significant advantages from that cash flow affordability perspective due to much reduced stamp duty costs, but also the full suite of depreciation benefits that are still applied to new build properties that make them much more affordable to hold long term. So that's pretty much the key aspects of my own personal investment philosophy. Dom?
There's a lot to unpack in there, and in my mind, it's all, it's all really good lessons and advice in there. And what I pick out of that is it really is tailored in many ways, as in depending on where you are, what your budget is, how old you are, what you're trying to achieve. There are a number of different types of investments that are suitable to you. But I also like the fact that you've identified the type of investor that you are. You're passive aggressive. There are a number of ways to make money in real estate. And what I chat about in my book is that profit and pain curve. And what I found is the more pain you're happy to undergo, typically the more profit you'll be able to chase down. The more passive it is and the less pain you have in there, and pain comes in a number of ways. It can be the time it takes for the investment to mature. Pain is the time that it takes for you to actually actively get in there, the experience that's required, the learning curve, the amount of cash. That's all more pain. The more cash you need to put into the investment, that's way more painful than something that's a minimal deposit.
Yeah.
So if you're going to have a look at that, the biggest and best way to make the most amount of money is to develop real estate, but that's a career. And you have to ask yourself, do I want to be a developer, or do I want to be a doctor, a mortgage broker, a painter, whatever else? And that's okay, because from developing, then you can scale all the way back to a whole myriad of other options. And as you said, I like a passive aggressive approach. And that's what I used for the first 4 or 5 properties that I did. It's pick good quality investments in high quality locations and then let the market do the lifting for me. And then rely on, as you said, the tax man, the tenant, and what was the last T?
Yeah, the tenant, the tax man, and the time. They're the three key T's. But it's something that is worth, and it sort of drawing the dots between what you've just shared with us, which is awesome. One of the things that I often talk to investors about is what you invest in and how you invest needs to be driven not only by how much money you can afford to put into it, but how much time have you got to actually manage that investment. Now, if you're a career focused and you've got a busy family and you're spending all of your spare time taxiing the kids around to sport on the weekends and working nights to make things happen in your career, then you're putting yourself at high risk if you dive into property development. You're better off, if you're time poor, to look at longer term exercise with low risk, so that you're sort of developing your passive wealth in parallel with your career. If you're wanting to make a career out of it and you want to dedicate a lot of time, but you've also got the horsepower to support it. So a lot of people forget that if you jump ship and you don't have that safe income flowing through, the banks aren't going to give you any money to actually make it happen anyway. So there's a fine balance here between your capacity from an equity and a buying capacity perspective, but that time piece. So I keep talking about time ad infinitum, because if you don't have time, then don't overextend yourself, because you get yourself into trouble.
I was just saying to you earlier, I was sick for the past week, and it's a function of stress and overextending myself, I'll have to say. And I have a bad habit of doing that. People that know I'm probably laughing right now, not at my expense, hopefully. But Look, I completely agree. And I actually like the fact that you do advocate for new real estate. There's a lot of naysayers, and I understand why people don't like new real estate. There are some shocking examples of new builds that are terrible, that have been built very poorly. But there are some really, really good examples of new builds that, the most sophisticated investors in the world, BlackRock is the biggest investor in the world. They're turning their attention to multi-resi developments, buying buildings, building apartments. The tax man helps them, the tenant helps them, the depreciation helps them. And if the most sophisticated investors in the world are looking at multifamily homes, there's something to be said there. They're not buying old shitty things and they're buying a building and letting it out. And there's something to be said there.
Yeah, and the build to rent phenomenon is about to sweep across Australia. There's a lot of government incentives coming into that area to do exactly that. That's going to be our version of multi-home. The one thing I would say though, to underscore the building side of the equation, is that I've been sitting out of that space for the last couple of years, because unless I can guarantee time, quality, and cost, then it's high risk. Now, the construction industry is still working its way through a pretty challenged time. There wouldn't be a week goes by where there's not another story of a major builder going bust. And I think there's a Four Corners showing up this week around exactly the same subject. But once it settles down, it's not too far away where you can actually get back to fixed price contracts with fixed delivery times, where the builder's accepting the risk if there's any blowouts. Then building is a really good vehicle to do it. So I don't think we're too far away. It might be 6 to 12 months away before I think it's worth dipping the toe back into that pond.
Completely agree. We're taking a little break from building. I'm building different things, and in each time I'm building one thing or another, it's tough. It's really tough out there. Now, Bushy, I'm just conscious of time, so I want to ask you a couple more questions. I've labeled this LFYP. It's a lesson for young players. Players being people playing life and trying to have a crack. Tell us about a time where you've made a mistake in your life that informed all of your decisions going forward.
Yeah, there's one major one, mate, because my life's been in two halves. I call it BC and AD, and it was before the crisis and after the divorce. It's pretty much how I've lived my life. Because before, I was following the Australian dream. I was an architect. I was working on great jobs. I was pouring money into super. I had a nice home, and I was going to tick off the bucket list when I retired. Well, I burnt myself out, mate. I ended up burnt out, broken, and broke at the tender age of 33. And that was a major wake-up call for me. So I pretty much took 2 years out. I call it my Howard Hughes years, mate, where I just hid myself while I did my master's in business, because that was the excuse. What I was actually doing was readjusting my headset to make sure that I was approaching life the right way. And about the same time, I got dragged along to a Robert Kiyosaki conference. He was actually live in Adelaide this was back in the late 90s. That's where the passive aggressive exercise came through. And that's where everything I've done since that point, as I say, must have a residual income, must grow in value, and must be saleable. So our businesses have been that way. Everything we've done since that point in time has been driven around that. And I encourage people to start thinking, developing that parallel perspective. So just don't focus on your job. Don't assume that your job is going to be everything to your life, because if you're working for someone else, that can be wiped out in a second, in a heartbeat. So make sure that you're becoming the worker and the wealth builder, and putting energy and time into it, and surrounding yourself with a team that's actually actively making that happen. And then you're just managing those managers to put yourself in a position where you're going to secure and attain and maintain your lifestyle long term.
I'm going to be annoying. Can you tell us about a specific story or a time? If you were to think back to a moment or a crisis, it doesn't have to be that bad, but just something where it hurt and you thought, I'm not going to do that again.
Yeah, okay. Well, my very first development, if we make it a property specific exercise, Dom, my very first entree into the property area, I started life as a rent investor, and was a rent investor for a long time. But pre the divorce, this was back when I think I was about 23, 24. I was an architect in Alice Springs at the time, and we'd been doing a lot of work with a developer builder. We decided, myself and two architect partners and this builder decided to do a 1-in-4 redevelopment. So we bought an old place on the east side of Alice Springs. We bolted over and built these 4 beautiful apartments, mate. They were absolutely stunning. And we did everything wrong you possibly could, Dom. We spent way too much on properties that were never going to sell. We thought, oh, these are going to be so good that people just fall over themselves to buy them. Mistake number 1. Mistake number 2, we weren't building to the market. So we weren't creating properties that the market was actually happy to pay for. So we completely outpriced ourselves. That meant we were stuck with the properties at the end. And you know, the rental income, we ended up putting tenants in them, and rent was way short. So they were negatively geared big time and burning a massive hole in our pocket. We didn't have a agreement amongst ourselves about the what ifs. So there was no shareholders agreement or prenup, which I've instituted ever since that point in time, whenever I'm doing anything with anyone else. And one of those parties got divorced. The other one had to fire sale it. Mate, it was the worst experience you could ever put into the property. I reckon I made every mistake you can make in that exercise. And that really flipped my lid into starting with the basics and getting back to the passive-aggressive approach of recognizing that if I bought a quality asset in a tightly held area that had the 3 eyes of growth attached to it and pretty much set and forget, that was going to be a better road to financial freedom than trying to create an empire in a day and get rich quick.
That is a beautiful story. I hate to smile at your expense, but God, they're the best ones. Those lessons that you walk away from just a shocking experience where you walk in thinking you're king shit. You think you've got all the answers, and it's all with the best of intent, but you walk away with your tail between your legs and you think, fuck, I did my ass on that one. And you kind of force it to find truth in that issue and find, I'm not going to walk away from this thing having just lost money. I'm going to walk away with some gold, and these are the lessons. And if I can feel the lessons you learn, build to the market, making sure you've got agreements that are in place, don't overspec the thing. There's so much in there that's valuable that become transformative for a young bloke like the 24-year-old man that you were to the man that you are today, right?
Yeah, I knew enough to be dangerous. And I didn't know what I didn't know, Dom. That was and the ego got in the way of good sense. So it was a massive learning curve. Really, but here's the thing, and this is what I would say to everyone. Just like learning to walk, if you fall over, you just don't give up on walking. You just keep getting up, but you're doing it differently every time, and eventually you're going to master what works for you. Because as you said at the outset, there's no one road to property. There's no silver bullet. It's what's right for you and your situation and your circumstance and your sleep at night factor at that time, and it will change. So it's not a one-size-fits-all strategy you adopt for the rest of your life. As you progress through your journey and your knowledge and familiarity and comfort level grows, then you'll start doing different and other things that are eventually going to get you to where you want to, which for me is giving us a residual income that now allows us the time and privilege of spending time talking to you and helping others along that journey.
Really good advice. And that comes to my next question. And this is a shameless plug for my book, You Won't Fuck It Up. What advice would you give to new investors or homeowners so they don't fuck up their next purchase?
Yeah, number one, whether you're a homeowner or a property investor, every property is an investment. Agreed. So don't think that you're a homeowner, it doesn't count, because it does. Because every property that you secure for whatever purpose must be investment grade, and it must have owner-occupier appeal. At some point, you're going to sell that property. And if you're just buying an investment grade property thinking you're going to sell it to investors, you're missing out on 70% of the buying market. So that's number one. Number two, start with the end in mind. Know your numbers before you start. Build it all on paper first before you even start thinking about the property. Third, make sure that you're very clear on where you want to end up, and therefore what sort of lifestyle you're going to live, what that lifestyle costs, because that'll tell you the nest egg that you need. Now, I call it the freedom numbers. We do freedom number estimates for all of our clients as the very first thing. How do you want to live? How much does that cost? What's the nest egg? If you do nothing, where you're going to end up? What's the gap? And then what's your capacity to fill that gap? Because that will determine what sort of strategy and what sort of properties you end up buying. So make sure you do that. And if any of your listeners want some help on that, then the Freedom Forecast that we produce, we'd be happy to assist people on that exercise. The third thing, coming back to what we said at the start, property is a game of finance. So apply the bare facts. And what are the bare facts? I'm talking about the grizzly bear: borrowings, equity, affordability, and risk. Get really clear on exactly how those things operate, because that will determine what your actual achievable and affordable purchase price power is. And then once you know that, find the highest growth location around the country that's going to satisfy that. So they're pretty much the key things that I would start. But the property is the last thing that you look at, not the first. So we all love to get sexy and scroll through the websites to look at properties and get excited about that. But if you haven't got everything else in line first, you're bound to make mistakes.
Oh, you've given it all away, Bushy. It feels like this is a masterclass in buying real estate and finance. There's so much to consider. I want to thank you very much for joining me on the show today. It's good to catch up with like-minded professionals that are out there doing their best, trying to help the people around them. And it's good talking to someone that's achieved many of the things that they're talking about, because you don't want to get advice from an idiot that hasn't done the things that you're trying to achieve. You know what I'm trying to say?
I do, mate. And believe you me, I've made a lot of mistakes along that journey. And mistakes are good, because that's where your biggest learnings come from. But like yourself, Dom, I'm very humbled and honoured to join you on the show. I'm looking forward to getting you on the Realty Talk Show before long to expand on some of these subjects that I know of interest to property owners, buyers and investors out there. So I really appreciate the opportunity to join you today, mate.
Thank you very much. And to all of you out there, I hope you enjoyed the show. Happy investing, happy house hunting, and we'll catch you all later. Bye-bye.